Comic Invasion!
Okay, so hello, I'm Miguel. I'm one of the 4 parts of the Spectra Universe so far. The other part, who did not say his name, is James, also known as Ashpure. No? No. Okay. Yeah, so thank you to ComicInvasionBerlin for having us over. We're going to try to speak about the general concept of the Spectra Universe and what we're trying to do with that. Then James and I are going to discuss some of the characters and the worlds that we have in it. And then towards the end, we'll have like questions and answers.
I have already a question.
Yes.
Choose the second and third part.
Okay, so the third part just exited. That's Lara, who is also basically behind everything that you've been seeing.
The godmother of Comic Invasion.
Yeah, of ComicInvasionBerlin, and another part is Saud, who is not with us here today.
Who sadly cannot be with us.
Very sadly. So what is Spectra, to get to business here? Our idea of Spectra is an episodic science fiction, science fantasy story where we try to tackle real world issues and do so by creating characters and worlds that somehow represent concerns that we have about the world in which we are living in. Besides that, the Spectra Universe project is also an open source project, so we think of it as licensed in terms of Creative Commons, where anybody can take characters, worlds, designs, and keep on playing with them and making them their own. And also where we have a maximalist approach, where we have everything that we do uploaded to our website. So we have anything from our podcast episodes to scribbled handwritten notes that we've taken at meetings, to the initial sketches, and then of course artwork in development and final art, especially in the form of a digital comic.
Yeah, the original reason for making it was the desire to make a story that would save the world. Because if we can't save the world with comics, then I'm fucked. Because that's all I can do. So it was, and the original seed of it, it started as it was very simple, and it was going to be a Saturday morning cartoon even, but that was a little too Captain Planet, if that resonates with anyone. And when we met our absent friend, Saud, he was the person that suggested it would be much more interesting than, rather than making something and then trying to get an audience for it and could get people engaged with it, was why not get people, different interesting people in to make this project. And it became something much more interesting when he was involved. And we started, first it was me and Saud, and we did 2 of the podcasts, and we generated the first 2 characters, and then Miguel came in, and he was the first guest creator, and then he became part of the core team, and that's the kind of the model for it, so that anybody can come with something that they want to talk about, an issue, a real world issue that they would like to talk about, and turn it into this science fictionalized space. So this taking concerns and belief systems of the real world and then folding them up into this science fictionalized space where we can talk about things that perhaps would be a little too uncomfortable to talk about in the real world. And should we talk about the characters? Is that a good way to start? Oh, serendipity. Let me just say a little quick bit about the characters that we created. So Saud, what's his role? What's his title? Is he studies?
Saud is an academic primarily. He has studied for a very long time religion and religion in its political and its social aspects. And here he did a doctorate. Here in Berlin, he did a doctorate in Islamic studies. So
yeah, his character Adul there is basically a young guy who is. We are not sure if he is planning to suicide bomb a moon, a planet. So this was something that was quite a kind of, let's say it was a hot topic, but it seemed that that's what science fiction is for. That's what fiction is for, perhaps, but especially science fiction, to take these real world things and talk about them in a way that you can, is a kind of safe space to then to examine these things and talk about it. And so, Miguel, would you like to talk about your character?
Yeah, or maybe we could add just something with Saud's character and world. So we have Saud thought up let's say a world where you have a moon that exploits the leftovers of a planet. For Saud, that's kind of a representation of the, let's say, the hydrocarbon extraction industry in the Middle East. He's from Kuwait, so he's familiar with this. And then we kind of explore the thing of opulence versus oppression, of richness and slavery. So that's a context in which Saud's character is debating the use of violence or not against those that are rich in power. This is one of the characters that I developed, and Donnie came from different sources. So one, the idea of trying to reimagine a Viking, a comic book that had a lot of influence on me when I was a kid is Camelot 3000. That's by Mike Barr and Bill Bullard, I think. Brian Bullard. And it's a very interesting take on Arthurian legend and putting it in the future and then twisting the characters around and making them different from what you would expect. So some of the knights are reincarnated as women. They're from different parts. They're not all British. So Donnie's kind of an attempt to rethink a Viking in, well, first of all, the era of Me Too and a very active feminism that tries to restructure what our understandings of femininity and masculinity and gender roles and sexuality and whatnot. Also, this kind of twisting the Viking culture and mythology outside of what we would expect from it. So the Viking boats here are spaceships, and the rowers are mathematicians and cryptographers. And Donnie herself is a shield maiden, but the shield is kind of like a plasma energy force field kind of thing. And with this character, the main thing I wanted to explore as well, old concepts and values like honor or honor through battle. What does that mean in our world today? Do these concepts still function? Can we understand these notions of honor and battling and being a warrior? And how do we do that without either making the female heroine hypersexualized or masculinized? So how do we make Donnie herself? So that's one character. Do you want to talk about maybe Ashpure, and then I'll talk about
sure. So Ashpure, some of you might know, was the name of a comic artist, very talented, ahead of his time, I would say, comic artist from Berlin, also responsible for this artwork, and that was the character that I chose to create in this universe. So Ashpure is in this universe is he presents himself as a shaman, as a kind of shamanic figure, but he also has this sort of yuppie swagger. And while all the characters are quite rooted in their kind of cultural heritage, we have Donnie representing this kind of Viking-inspired civilization. We have Alu coming from his sort of favela-style exploited world, and then we have Ashpure as this kind of, on first appearance, a very slick kind of Doctor Who-like mercurial figure, who then, through the process of the story, is revealed to be a bit of a charlatan, perhaps, and actually is he just a kind of a rich kid on his gap year who has assimilated these kind of spiritual, magical tropes and is using it to appear wise to the other civilizations that he meets, in turn to exploit them. And for me, it was I wanted to talk about this idea of I wanted to explore the idea of the kind of middle-class liberal who talks a very good game in terms of their kind of socio-political views, but then when it comes to the crunch, are they just motivated by the desire to keep themselves in the manner that they've become accustomed? And it was also, I wanted to have a cool character in a hat, because that's what I like in comics. Then, yeah, I think Ashpure is the kind of, it's Ashpure and Adul's dynamic that is explored in the first arc, and it's the Adul's as being coming from a very real place and being with good reason to be angry, versus Ashpure's kind of lofty liberalism, and then how do these things actually kind of intersect? And that is kind of played out live in the podcasts, and it's still not finished. It's still ongoing, so we still don't know how it actually plays out. And so we've got the characters we've mentioned so far, and then the kind of older, wiser, the Obi-Wan Kenobi character. That's back to you.
Yeah. So another character that we affectionately call HI, or higher intelligence, was a very much longer, more complicated name, is an attempt to make a twist on the, let's call it the wise old turtle character. So somebody that's been along for a very, very long time, beyond let's say a human lifespan, or what's expected to be a human lifespan, and is wise in a certain way, but that also kind of makes them stand back a little bit, and then at some point they feel that they have to engage. So that whole character trope, I tried to explore it a little bit differently by mashing two things that I like very much. So on the one hand, Asian philosophies, specifically Taoism or Taoism, and so this whole idea of the wise man that does nothing and leaves nothing undone, and kind of like a utopian society, but that's mashed up with technology. So HI is basically a digitalized consciousness that, as many other digitalized consciousness, lives in a kind of mainframe, matrix-like world where an infinity of communities and possible communities are simulated. So the trick here, and this is like the question that HI brings to the table in terms of where we're going, us actually, with regards to technology, is that all these simulated worlds, you can enter them, but then you can't really leave. So you can digitalize yourself and enter this mainframe to which HI belongs, but you can only exit it as a digitalized conscious that operates a robot. So that's basically what HI is, a robot of sorts. And so he has a kind of like ubiquitous role. He's everywhere. He can upload and download himself everywhere. And he's kind of, these images that we're seeing here are like mathematical and statistical projections that HI is doing of the future, and that's how he gets all these heroes involved, because he can detect that there is dark forces looming in the horizon of space-time, which is, if it sounds like nowadays, well, it's supposed to sound like nowadays.
It's interesting that you said a collection of heroes, actually, because I've never seen them that way, the characters that we'd collected. And I think we're not striving to make something that doesn't conform to any kind of hero's journey, or to cite the Holy Trinity as it was, the Star Wars kind of mythos. I think we're happy to let things, the story-wise, kind of conform to these sort of traditional models, and not sort of what we're interested in is perhaps more the way of making the story. So the way that if something really can be communally made. So at the moment it's for people, and the dream really is that we put these assets online, and that people can kind of take up these stories, and even in a kind of a sort of GitHub, let's call it, if I can sort of use that terminology, that these people could take story aspects and carry them on their own path. Maybe they'd be kind of, you know, two parallel running stories, and ultimately massive fan base would then decide which one they wanted, and the story could kind of branch off in multiple different ways, and people could come and add their world, add their characters, add their world. We kind of had a fledgling, what we were calling a kind of translation matrix, which would be where people could come and input their beliefs, let's call it, their belief systems, and then it would generate a character for them. But that, at the moment, we do it manually, let's say. We do it by sitting around. But there's one other character that we haven't mentioned. Should we take a moment to mention Morgan?
Yeah, sure.
Morgan comes from...
Do you want to mention Morgan?
Morgan comes from, maybe you'll see if you can guess where the inspiration for this came from. Comes from a world called Blavaria. What was it? Blavaria. Blavaria, which is a very functional. Well, everyone is, you know, has a good quality of life, and it's a very sort of perfect world, but rather boring. And they leave this world and go on they join the adventurers. I think adventurers maybe rather than heroes. And they're a non-binary character, and I wondered actually if maybe that wasn't the point, and actually everybody on Blavaria could be that way, and it's just part of their kind of, you know, uniformity, that there's no point of difference. So we have these H.I., Ashpure, Morgan, Adul, and Donnie. And the first story arc, which was done in 10 podcasts, gets all these characters together, puts them in a tricky situation, and then that's kind of the setup. And then it's, yeah, the idea is that this story, either we carry it on, somebody else carries it on, or other people come, they introduce characters, we start new stories. There's a kind of, literally a whole universe to build.
Yeah, and as James was saying before regarding the podcast is also has this maximalist approach where we started out just trying to figure out what we wanted to do, right? So the first 2 episodes are Sud and James talking about this Saturday morning cartoon with like guests that come over and contribute something to it. Then when I came along, we started to talk more about the characters themselves and how maybe they could interact. By the time Laura came in, then we started to have those characters as well and try to find the story as such. So if you hear the podcast, they'll be like, well, what do we have to do for next week? And so then they reach, you know, the airlock, and so there's a lot of going back and forth with trying to be creative in the moment and not polishing so much stuff outside of the podcast space, let's call it, let's say. And then, of course, the artwork that you've seen and the scripts, those are other things that are also recorded in podcast format, but that does have a lot of behind the podcast space work, and that's why we also upload it on the website. So with all of these materials, I think what we're trying to do is, in a way, enable people to take over whatever they find there that they might like. If anybody's ever had a question, well, how do I do a digital comic? How do I come up with a story? How do I come up with the characters? Well, that's at least our take on it. That's not the only take, of course, but at least an attempt to kind of like open up the writer's room and the creative process and share it with people so they can see that most of the time projects start with some bare bones ideas and then start building up their own inertia.
I think it's one of those things, it's okay, this might be very interesting if it was the writer's room for Game of Thrones. Is it interesting if it's the writer's room for a comic that nobody's heard of? I would say yes, and you should check it out. But I think the most interesting part is, what would you want to add to this world? What would you kind of want to bring to it as the not a passive audience, but a kind of active exchange where anybody can come and anybody can put themselves in this world, and what would they bring to it? Well, we've got a kind of infinite space to fill, and we did some workshops last year where people came and we generated stories in the day, and I'd love to do more of that. I'd also love to get more people, individuals, to come in and sit and do the podcasts, but obviously also would love people to read the comic, which is kind of growing before your eyes online. And I think that's all I'd like to necessarily say about it. And yeah, is that good? And yeah, if anyone has any questions about that, whether we're getting involved or about anything, any part of the process at all, then now's the fucking time. In a nice way.
Ich kann übersetzen.
Also ich bin ganz ein Laie.
Ja.
Ist das jetzt digital gezeichnet oder ist das es war ja vorher eine Zeichnung,
Ja.
und das sah aus wie ganz normal
Ja.
gezeichnet und
Ja.
dann digitalisiert, und wie dieses Podcast habe ich nicht ganz verstanden. Ist das jetzt also dass sich jeder beteiligt,
Ja.
das habe ich schon verstanden, aber ich dachte immer, ein Podcast ist in sich geschlossen dann doch die Botschaft.
Ah, okay.
Und nicht ein völlig offener Prozess, wo jeder alles machen kann, was
Yeah.
er will.
The first one is the creative process of artwork. Like first you scribble and then is it digitalized? How is?
Like this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How do you do that? And the second one was about the podcast. How do we have this open source way of doing a podcast? Because usually it's a very fixed thing with a fixed message. So how do we do that as an open source thing? So maybe you can talk a bit about your art process, and you can do a bit of podcast.
So yeah, these ones are, it's photo montage, and these lines are vector shapes. So it's using these frames are Photoshop. This is Adobe Illustrator, and in the background there is a space plate from using open source image. And then the characters are hand drawn and coloured and scanned and coloured, but the background is all using open source royalty-free images to compose these landscapes.
Computer gaming or what?
It's all photographs that are then come together, and then everything kind of coloured to give it a uniformity. And then so you can see on the character on the right, there are then these photographic elements comped in on the eyes and the chest plate to sort of then bridge the gap between the environments and the characters. It's basically, how can I make it as long and difficult a process as humanly possible? That's my preferred working method.
I'm not exactly sure if I fully understood the question about the podcast, but when we say that we kind of put it out there so that people can see the processes that we do. There might be an agenda at the beginning of the podcast. I think many podcasts are fairly scripted, or at least well organized. Ours is more chaotic in the sense that sometimes we are discussing things and sharing our opinions. Sometimes we're just being creative and maybe thinking the next couple of panels of the comic, how does it have to be? So we'll decide one thing and then we'll go, no. And then we'll go back and change something. And we'll go, I got a better idea. So it's very chaotic and confusing. But we hope that it's helpful also to kind of like demystify how creative processes go, or that they're not necessarily so orderly, or that you can find inspiration suddenly in a twist of a second, kind of way. And open source, more what we were mentioning before in terms of open source, is that The characters in the world, and like the entire Spectra universe, is open source in the sense that as long as you say, well, these characters are taken from Spectra Universe, then you can basically reimagine them, draw them again anew, write short stories based on them, do an illustration. So it's not like a copyright royalties based project, but more like, well, we create something, we leave it out there, and people can play with it as well. Yes, from all over the world, and that's why our interest is to have it all online, so it can be easier to access.
It's invasion time!